They say you should never get into a war with your HOA, but when the HOA starts messing with your utilities, all bets are off. My name's Quillan Price. I'm a 41-year-old electrician with a stubborn streak and a 6-foot privacy fence to match. I bought my home in Maple Hollow Estates 8 years ago. Quiet town, decent schools, and, for the most part, good neighbors. The only real problem was the HOA, specifically the president, Wanda Whitmore. A bleach blonde control freak with a permanent frown and a clipboard that might as well have been surgically attached to her hand. Wanda had a habit of patrolling the neighborhood like she was guarding Fort Knox. If your grass was an inch too high or your garbage bin was visible for 5 minutes past pickup, you'd get one of her sanctimonious letters. I kept to myself, followed the rules mostly, and figured she'd leave me alone. That was until last July, when I got a letter stating I owed the HOA $375 in excess water consumption fines. I stood in my kitchen, rereading the letter at least 10 times. Water consumption. Since when does the HOA monitor that? I walked outside, crossed the driveway, and popped open the lid to my water meter. I knew exactly where it was. I'd installed a smart sensor myself 2 years ago to keep an eye on my usage during drought season. But the sensor was gone. Clean break. Someone had physically removed it. That's when the red flags went up. I called the water utility company first thing the next morning. "No, sir, we don't share water usage with your HOA," the rep told me. "They'd need a court order to even see your account." "Then how would they know how much water I'm using?" I asked. "They wouldn't," she replied, "unless they're checking the meter themselves, but that's against policy." Interesting. I hung up and walked straight to the HOA office, which was of course conveniently located in Wanda Whitmore's oversized garage. She'd converted it into a little command center, complete with surveillance monitors and HOA banners. Wanda opened the door in her usual pastel tracksuit and sneer. "Oh, Quillan," she said, dragging out my name like it tasted sour. "Here to pay your fine." "No," I said, handing her the letter. "I'm here to ask why you think you can fine me over water usage." She pursed her lips. "We had a board meeting. It was voted on. Excessive water usage during a drought violates the environmental clause in our community standards." "There's no clause about water," I replied. "I read the bylaws last night." She folded her arms. "Then maybe you missed the amendment we passed last quarter." "Where's the copy?" "It's posted on the bulletin board outside the clubhouse," she said, too fast. I stared at her for a moment. "Funny, I was at the clubhouse last weekend." There was nothing on the board but a flyer for the community BBQ and a lost cat poster. Her expression twitched. "Also," I added, "you're not legally allowed to tamper with the city's water meter. Mine's been messed with. My monitoring sensor's missing." She didn't flinch. "That sensor was unauthorized. It interfered with our readings." I blinked. "Your readings? It's not your meter, Wanda, it's the city's." She clutched her clipboard tighter. "You've been warned. If the fine isn't paid in 10 days, we'll file a lien." And just like that, she slammed the door in my face. Now, I don't like being pushed around, but I especially don't like being lied to, so I got to work. First, I reinstalled a new sensor on the water meter. This one had a micro camera embedded inside it, nothing illegal, just a little insurance in case someone decided to mess with it again. Next, I called a friend of mine from the city's water department, a buddy named Travis who owed me a favor. He confirmed that my account was normal, no spike in usage, no red flags. In fact, my house was using less water than the average home in the neighborhood, which made the fine even more suspicious. 3 days later, I got my proof. I came home from work and checked the footage from the meter cam. There she was, Wanda Whitmore, crouched beside my water meter at 10:47 a.m., wearing gardening gloves and prying the lid open like she owned it. She pulled out my sensor, dropped it into a plastic bag, and replaced it with a cheap knockoff that had a blinking red light. I rewound the footage and watched it again just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Nope, that was her. Clear as day. I downloaded the footage, saved it to 3 different flash drives, and backed it up to the cloud. Then I printed stills and labeled the date and time. I didn't go back to Wanda. I went to the county courthouse. I filed a formal complaint of utility tampering and fraud against the HOA. I attached the footage, the letter demanding payment, and a notarized statement from the utility company confirming the HOA had no legal authority to access or monitor meters. 3 days later, I was contacted by a county investigator named Marla Denson. She asked if I'd be willing to testify in court. Absolutely, I said. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. Within a week, 5 other homeowners came forward. Same fines, same fake excess water usage claims. And guess what? All of them had missing sensors. We all had one thing in common: we'd spoken up at HOA meetings or challenged Wanda's decisions in the past. This wasn't about water. It was retaliation. We banded together and hired a lawyer, a sharp local guy named Reese, who had a reputation for chewing up HOA boards and spitting them out. Reese filed a civil suit alongside the criminal complaint. We were going after the HOA for fraud, harassment, and unauthorized utility tampering. When the court date came, Wanda walked into the courtroom in a navy pantsuit like she was the queen of suburbia. She still had her clipboard. I don't think she realized what was about to hit her. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Mahoney, didn't even let her finish her opening statement before cutting her off. "Miss Whitmore, are you aware that tampering with a city water meter is a felony?" Wanda blinked. "I was acting in the interest of the community. That's not what I asked," Judge Mahoney snapped. "Did you or did you not open the complainant's water meter and remove his personal property?" Yes, but it wasn't authorized. According to the city, it was. "And according to this footage," the judge held up a still image, "you committed an illegal act on private property." Wanda looked like she was about to faint. It got worse when the judge asked about the amendment Wanda claimed had passed. There was no amendment, no meeting minutes, no vote. "No documentation of any kind. Miss Whitmore," Judge Mahoney said, "you've lied, tampered with city property, and issued fraudulent fines to multiple residents. I am referring this case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. In the meantime, I am ordering an immediate freeze on all HOA financial activity pending a full audit." Wanda's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Additionally, you are hereby removed from your position as HOA president effective immediately. Security will escort you out." And just like that, the clipboard was gone. So was Wanda, but the best part. That came later when the audit revealed that Wanda had been funneling HOA funds into a maintenance account that didn't exist, over $20,000 gone. She was arrested 2 days later, and me. I got a letter from the new interim HOA board, apologizing and revoking every fine they'd issued. I framed it. It's hanging in my garage right next to my toolbox, because in this neighborhood, justice finally flowed like water. The day after Wanda was escorted from the courthouse, Maple Hollow Estates felt different. The usual tight-lipped nods from neighbors were replaced with real greetings. People walked their dogs a little slower, lingered at mailboxes, even waved from porches. It was like someone had finally cracked open a window in a stuffy room and fresh air was pouring in. I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Wanda's removal was a win, sure. But the HOA still existed, and the remaining board members, though quieter, had all voted to support her phony water fine campaign. That told me one thing: this wasn't just a rogue president. It ran deeper. I spent the next few days clearing out my garage. Not for spring cleaning, but to convert the back wall into a workspace. I mounted a corkboard, organized files, and started building a timeline. I wasn't just interested in the bogus fines anymore. I wanted to know what else had been going on while Wanda had her clipboard reign. That's when a name kept popping up: Calvin Rusk. He wasn't flashy like Wanda. In fact, I barely remembered seeing him at all, but his signature was on nearly every HOA letter I'd received over the past 3 years. He was the treasurer, or had been. Quiet, balding, always wore a polo shirt tucked into jeans. I'd seen him once fixing a gutter on the clubhouse roof, but he kept to himself. I figured it was time to talk to someone who might know more. "Janine, you got a minute?" I asked one afternoon as my next-door neighbor was unloading groceries from her car. She was a retired nurse with a sharp memory and an even sharper sense of fairness. I'd caught her once yelling at Wanda for trying to ban wind chimes. She closed her trunk and gave me a nod. If this is about that HOA mess, I've got hours. You ever deal with Calvin Rusk? Her face shifted. Calvin? Yeah, he's the one who kept raising the annual dues, said it was for common area improvements, but I never saw a single improvement. Still got the same pothole near the entrance we had in 2016. Did he ever explain where the funds went? Nope. Always said it was in the quarterly report, but those stopped showing up 2 years ago. Wanda claimed they were going paperless. I frowned. And nobody questioned that. Oh, we did, she said. At first. But then Wanda would start citing bylaws nobody had ever read, and most folks let it go. A few of us pushed back, but they made things. Inconvenient how? She looked around, then leaned in. I got a letter saying my fence was 3 inches too high. 3 inches. Then they fined me $75. When I appealed, they tacked on a processing fee. Next thing I knew, I was out over $100 for a fence that's been here since '98. That was enough for me. That night, I pulled every HOA communication I'd saved: letters, dues invoices, violation notices, and started connecting dots. The same pattern emerged across all of them. Decisions made without meeting minutes, vague expenses, and increases in fees with no explanation. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Our little group of plaintiffs, me, Janine, and the others who joined the original water meter complaint, had kept in touch. I called a meeting at my place. We packed into my garage, folding chairs around the workbench, files and folders stacked high. Here's what I've got, I said, clicking on a small projector I'd borrowed from work. Over the last 4 years, our HOA dues went from $400 to $650 per year. That's over a 60% increase. But the spending report stopped 2 years ago. What happened 2 years ago? Asked Aaron, a quiet mechanic who lived at the end of the street. Calvin took over full control of the HOA's financial software. Wanda announced it in one of the newsletters, said it was to streamline accounting. After that, nobody saw another detailed report. Janine narrowed her eyes. So where's the money going? I intend to find out. We formed a plan. Aaron offered to help with tech. He had a custom-built laptop and knew how to dig through databases. Cindy, another neighbor, had worked in compliance for a bank and knew how to read financials like a second language. We weren't just homeowners, we were a task force now. Aaron managed to gain access to the HOA's online portal. The security was laughable: no firewall, default passwords. Within an hour, he had downloaded every bank statement tied to the HOA over the past 5 years. The findings were jaw-dropping. There were payments going out monthly to a company called Clearview Property Services. Tens of thousands of dollars. The problem? That company didn't exist. We ran the name through every registry and business license database in the state. Nothing. No address, no contact info, no tax ID. Just payments regular and increasing. Looks like someone's been laundering HOA funds, Cindy said, her expression unreadable. We compiled everything: statements, screenshots, audit trails, and brought it straight to investigator Marla Denson, the same county official who'd handled the water meter case. She didn't blink once during the hour-long presentation. This is organized fraud, she said when we finished. And if your records are accurate, it's not just Wanda, it's Rusk, possibly others. We left her office with a sense of grim satisfaction. A week later, subpoenas were issued. By then, the interim HOA board had called a special election. I didn't want to run. I preferred my tools and wires to politics, but Janine said something that stuck. We can't just tear down the rot, she said. We have to build something better in its place. So I ran, and I won. So did Janine and Aaron. The entire board was reshaped overnight. We held our first open meeting in the community clubhouse, standing room only. People came with questions, ideas, and for the first time in a long while, hope. I won't pretend we can fix everything overnight, I told them. But transparency starts now. The mood shifted again in late fall when the county prosecutor announced indictments against Calvin Rusk and 2 other former board members. Charges included wire fraud, falsifying financial records, and embezzlement. The judge ordered restitution of over $70,000 to the HOA, plus individual fines. Rusk was arrested at his house during breakfast. According to the paper, he tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding. But the financials didn't lie. The funds started returning within weeks. The city granted us a temporary manager to oversee operations while we restructured the bylaws. We hosted community workshops, rewrote outdated policies, and removed every clause that had been abused by the previous regime. And the best part, we instituted a new rule: any board decision involving money had to be posted publicly, with a 30-day waiting period for resident input. I still had my day job, still fixed electrical panels and rewired breaker boxes. But now, I got nods from neighbors who used to avoid eye contact. People stopped me at the store to say thanks. We'd taken a system designed to intimidate and turned it into something that worked for us. Justice didn't come from a single courtroom victory. It came from refusing to shut up, from digging, asking questions, and refusing to let arrogance and fraud run unchecked. Maple Hollow wasn't perfect, but it was finally ours again. The first few months after the indictments flew by in a blur of policy rewrites, budget reviews, and town hall meetings. We didn't just inherit a broken HOA, we inherited a tangled mess of inconsistent enforcement, half-finished maintenance projects, and invoices for services that never existed. But the deeper we dug, the more we found, and none of it prepared us for what we discovered in late February. It started with a call from a woman named Andrea Mendez, who lived 4 streets over. I didn't know her well, only recognized her as the one who always had solar lights lining her walkway in perfect symmetry. She left a message on the new HOA voicemail saying she had something we needed to see and that it involved the old board's secret fund. I met her the next evening. She greeted me on her porch with a file folder clutched tight in one hand and her eyes darting toward the street like she expected someone to be watching. "I didn't want to come forward before," she said, stepping inside. "I was scared they'd do to me what they did to my neighbor." I raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements, not HOA accounts, but personal ones. They belonged to a man named Jeremy Haskin, who had served quietly as the HOA's grounds committee liaison. I barely remembered him. He resigned before the audit just up and disappeared. Andrea tapped the top statement. "See the deposits." They matched the dates and amounts of the supposed payments to Clearview Property Services. I leaned in. She was right. Every payment the HOA made to that bogus company showed up as a deposit into Haskin's personal checking account under a routing number from a bank in Nevada. "How'd you get these?" I asked. "My sister's a forensic accountant," Andrea said. "She helped me after I noticed something weird last year. Jeremy had paid full cash for a brand new F-150, no financing. I thought it was odd, but didn't ask questions. Then I overheard him on the phone in his backyard, said something about scrubbing the records and making sure Wanda destroyed the backup drive. I exhaled slowly. "You think there's another drive?" "I know there is," she said. "He told someone he kept a copy of everything, just in case she turned on him." That changed everything. If a second drive existed, it could contain emails, spreadsheets, maybe even scanned documents that hadn't been turned over in the original audit. And if Haskin had been running the fake vendor scheme, then it wasn't just embezzlement. It was criminal conspiracy. I thanked Andrea and made copies of everything. Then I called Marla Denson again. By the next morning, the county's white-collar crime unit had a warrant. They raided Haskin's property and found the backup drive stashed in a locked toolbox inside his attic. It was encrypted, but they cracked it within a day, and what they found blew the case wide open. The drive contained detailed ledgers showing that, over an 18-month period, the old HOA board had laundered nearly $145,000 through 3 fake companies. The money trail didn't stop there. It linked to personal expenses, luxury vacations, cosmetic procedures, even a down payment on a rental cabin in the Smoky Mountains. But the worst part, hidden in one folder labeled utilities, were scanned forms doctored utility bills. They'd been used to justify fines not just for water overuse, but for grid strain, a made-up term they applied to homes with high electricity usage. The files showed they'd been forging signatures from city officials, creating fake letterheads, and sending out fabricated violations to silence anyone who opposed them. That put us in a whole new realm. This wasn't just a scam, it was federal crime territory. Wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The county handed the case over to the state prosecutor, who looped in the FBI. I was called in again as a witness, along with Andrea and the auditor who had first flagged the financial inconsistencies. They asked us to walk them through everything: how the board operated, what patterns we'd seen, how the community had been affected. They weren't just building a case against Haskin, they were building one against the entire former board. 2 weeks later, the arrests began. Jeremy Haskin was taken into custody while leaving a golf course in a rented Lexus. 2 others, board secretary Dana Sloss and former vice president Mark Fenner, were arrested in coordinated morning raids. Charges were extensive: wire fraud, falsifying public records, conspiracy to commit fraud, and impersonating government officials. The fallout in the neighborhood was immediate. Homeowners who had kept their heads down started coming forward. One woman had received a forged letter claiming her home was out of compliance with city grid standards and was forced to pay a $1,200 fine or face a lien. Another resident, a retired Air Force technician, said he'd been fined for excessive satellite signal interference, a term so absurd it sounded like a prank, only it had cost him over $600. We compiled every fraudulent fine, every doctored letter, and turned it over to the legal team. The judge approved a restitution fund to be paid back to affected residents using the recovered funds from the seized accounts. But the case also exposed something else. The HOA had rigged previous board elections. Aaron discovered it while reviewing old voting records. He noticed that in 2 separate elections, the vote count exceeded the number of eligible homeowners. When we pulled the registration logs, we found dozens of homeowners listed under fabricated names and addresses that didn't exist. Some were just slight variations on actual residents, like John McCready and John McReady. Each had cast a vote in favor of Wanda, Calvin, and their cronies. We brought it to Judge Mahoney, who had overseen the first case. She immediately ordered a forensic audit of all prior election results and invalidated both suspect elections. That gave us legal ground to open an investigation into voter fraud and to nullify several of the policies Wanda's board had passed during their time in power. At that point, the story went regional. Reporters showed up, camera crews camped near the clubhouse, and homeowners gave interviews about the years of abuse. Wanda, already under investigation, tried to argue that she'd been misled by her treasurer, but the emails from the recovered drive told a different story. In one, she wrote, "We'll call it a compliance sweep. Most of them won't appeal, and we can use the fines to cover the new landscaping." That email alone was enough to tank any defense she had left. By the time the grand jury handed down indictments against all 7 members of the former board, the charges included a staggering list: structuring financial transactions to avoid detection, mail fraud, computer crimes, obstruction of justice, and destruction of public records. The court proceedings stretched into summer. I testified twice. Each time I watched as the defendants sat behind their attorneys, their expressions hollow. The woman who once strutted around our neighborhood issuing citations for crooked lawn gnomes now sat in silence as the judge read through a list of offenses that would follow her for the rest of her life. In the final ruling, Judge Mahoney didn't hold back. This court finds the defendants engaged in a sustained campaign of deceit, manipulation, and theft under the guise of community leadership, she said. They abused trust, falsified documents, and weaponized authority for personal gain. She sentenced Wanda and Haskin to 6 years each in state prison, with the others receiving various probationary and custodial sentences based on involvement. Restitution was ordered in full, and any remaining HOA funds under their control were seized and rerouted into a community improvement trust managed by the new board under public oversight. But perhaps the most important outcome was what followed. We rewrote the HOA charter from scratch. We eliminated discretionary fine powers, instituted term limits, and created an independent resident council that reviewed all board actions quarterly. We added a policy that any financial transaction over $500 required dual signatures and full public disclosure. We even created a neighborhood oversight app coded by Aaron that allowed residents to anonymously report concerns or suspected policy violations, which were then reviewed by a rotating panel of residents. The first thing we used the restitution fund for, fixing the potholes at the entrance finally. The second thing, installing community garden beds near the clubhouse. They were Janine's idea, and seeing neighbors planting together on a Saturday morning did something none of us expected. It started to heal the place. The HOA hadn't just been corrupt, it had been a parasite. Now, for the first time in years, the community could begin to grow again. And me. I'm still on the board, though I made it clear I won't run again once my term ends. I didn't sign up for politics, but I wasn't going to walk away while there was still work to do. What happened here wasn't just about one meter, one fine, or one fraud. It was about showing that when power is abused, it can be taken back. That no matter how deep the rot runs, it can be cut out. You just have to be willing to open the lid and look. By the time summer ended, Maple Hollow barely resembled the place it had been a year before. Gone were the quiet tension and the constant low-level anxiety of dealing with petty fines and surveillance. The gardens were in bloom, the streets were clean, and the new HOA board had earned something that once seemed impossible: trust. But just when we thought we'd cleared the last of the rot, something came up that changed everything again. It started with a construction crew. One morning in late September, a flatbed truck rolled into the neighborhood carrying 20-foot metal piping, a backhoe, and a generator. They parked near the East Retention Pond, a spot that sat on the border of the subdivision and the adjacent undeveloped land owned by the city. The crew wore bright vests with the logo of a utility subcontractor I didn't recognize. Janine called me from the scene, her voice unusually tense. "They're digging next to the pond," she said. "Said they're laying irrigation lines for a new greenbelt." But that land's not zoned for anything like that. When I arrived, the crew was already trenching. The foreman was polite but unhelpful, waving a clipboard and insisting they had permits signed by the HOA. I asked to see the paperwork. The signatures were familiar: Wanda Whitmore, Calvin Rusk. Dated 6 months before our board took over, the foreman pointed to a line item authorizing a sustainable water redistribution system. It was vague, but the permit had a seal and a city logo. I snapped pictures and told him to halt work until we verified the documents. He hesitated, then agreed to pause temporarily. I drove straight to the city planning office. The woman at the front desk recognized the permit number but pulled it from the database with a confused look. "This was flagged for irregularities last spring," she said. "It's not valid." The seal's been copied onto an old template that hasn't been used in over a decade. "Who flagged it?" I asked. "One of our zoning officers. He caught it during a random review of pending projects. It was marked for further investigation but never followed up." I asked to speak to that officer. Turned out he'd retired in June, but he left behind a folder labeled Maple Hollow HOA Suspicious Permits. Inside were scanned copies of 3 documents: the fake irrigation permit, an approval for a community solar array, and most concerning, a contract for a private well installation marked confidential. That stopped me cold. Private wells in our area were heavily regulated due to aquifer depletion concerns. Drilling required environmental surveys, public notice, and in most cases, city council approval. But this permit, dated almost 2 years ago, bore no evidence of any of those steps. Yet it had a stamped approval and what appeared to be Wanda's signature next to a contractor contact. I called Travis, the same contact at the water department who'd helped me during the meter fiasco. He met me at the site later that afternoon. As we stood near the pond, he scanned the terrain and narrowed his eyes. "They trenched here before," he said. "See that patch? Soil compaction's different. Looks like they backfilled it." He pulled out a handheld ground-penetrating radar unit from his truck and scanned the area. The screen lit up with a series of irregular shapes about 10 feet down. "That's a borehole," he said. "And those lines, polyethylene pipe, someone drilled a well here." But why? I asked. You're not going to like the answer. I didn't. Travis sent a formal request to the city's environmental department. Within 2 days, they confirmed the presence of an unauthorized groundwater well. It had been illegally tapped into the municipal aquifer line, a direct violation of state resource codes. Worse, it was tied into the community's irrigation system, meaning for at least 18 months, the HOA had been drawing water illegally to cut utility costs. It explained how they kept landscaping pristine without blowing their budget. They weren't paying for water at all. The city launched a formal investigation. By early October, the Environmental Compliance Task Force had cordoned off the area. Soil samples were taken, and inspectors traced the illegal tap to a hidden control valve buried beneath a fake boulder near the clubhouse. I was called in the following week to testify before a state environmental review board. I brought everything: photos, Travis's scans, the forged permits, and the contractor list from the backup drive we'd recovered months earlier. The contractor named on the well permit. A defunct company dissolved 4 years ago. Its listed phone number now belonged to a dry cleaner in a neighboring town. The board was stunned. One of the inspectors pulled me aside afterward and said it was one of the most blatant cases of utility theft he'd seen in decades. Wanda and Calvin had orchestrated the installation of a private well under forged permits, connected it to the HOA's irrigation system, and then used it to slash their operating costs, all while raising dues and doling out fines for excess consumption. The final nail came when the state subpoenaed emails from the backup drive. In one, Wanda wrote to Calvin, "Once the well's done, we can stop paying the city and reroute the savings. Let them think it's rain sensors." That was enough. The state filed felony charges for environmental violations, theft of public resources, unauthorized drilling, and conspiracy to defraud a municipal utility. Under state law, each count carried serious prison time, and this time it wasn't just a civil matter. The trial began in mid-November. I was called to testify again, along with Travis, the former zoning officer, and 2 city engineers. The courtroom was packed. Wanda, Calvin, and their attorney tried to argue that the well had been experimental and that they'd intended to disclose it at the appropriate time. The judge, a no-nonsense environmental court veteran, didn't buy it for a second. "You forged permits, drilled into a protected aquifer, and diverted municipal water without authorization," she said. "Your actions compromised public resources and endangered a regulated ecosystem." She handed down the maximum sentence, 10 years for Calvin, 12 for Wanda, with mandatory restitution to the city and revocation of all future eligibility to serve in any official capacity for a registered community organization. The court also ordered the HOA, under our new board's leadership, to cooperate with environmental remediation. We worked with city officials to safely decommission the well, reseal the access point, and install a permanent monitoring system around the pond to ensure the aquifer hadn't been contaminated. The entire cleanup was funded by the restitution fund created from the asset seizures. By the time winter rolled in, Maple Hollow was something else entirely. The fines were gone. The fear was gone. The secrets were gone. We held a winter festival in early December, our first real community event since this whole nightmare started. Kids ran through the snow, the community center was lit up with string lights, and someone even brought in a food truck. Janine organized a raffle. Aaron brought a portable heater he'd built himself. Cindy passed out cookies shaped like water droplets. Just for the irony, no one talked about Wanda. No one needed to. We knew what we'd come through. And more importantly, we knew what we'd built from the ashes. I stepped back near the garden beds, watching the crowd. People were laughing, not calculating which way to look to avoid a violation. The HOA, once a tool of intimidation, had become a framework for actual community, not because of rules, but because we wrote them together. And as I looked out at the neighborhood, the real neighborhood, I realized something. It wasn't justice that changed the place. It was the people who decided enough was enough and kept going until no one could ignore it.